The men climbed the hillside, expecting to find a body. That was the truth of it, though none of them said out loud as they walked. The storm had broken 2 days before, the worst one anyone in the territory could remember, and the widow on the ridge had not been seen since it started. Walton Pierce carried a shovel he hoped he would not need to use on frozen ground. Behind him, 3 other neighbors carried blankets, in case there was still a chance those blankets would matter. They called the place "She Lived in the Tomb." Nobody remembered exactly who had said it first, only that the name had stuck the way cruel names do, easy and quick, long before anyone had bothered to ask why a widow with a young son would choose a hollow in solid rock over a proper house. Pierce reached the dark opening first. He expected cold air to meet him, the kind of cold that settles into stone and never leaves. Instead, what came out to meet him was the smell of baking bread. Inside, Margaret Colby was kneeling by a low fire, turning a pan, her son asleep under a quilt with color still in his cheeks. Pierce reached out and touched the near wall, without meaning to, the way a man touches something he does not believe. The stone was not cold. It was not warm enough to call comfortable, not the kind of heat a hearth throws into a room, but it held something steady against his palm, something that should not have been there 2 days after the worst blizzard in 52 years had buried the whole territory in white. Nobody had an answer for that yet, not even Pierce, who had spent 30 years reading weather and rock and had never seen ground behave the way this hollow had behaved. To understand what he was touching, you have to go back to the autumn before, to the week Margaret Colby buried her husband and started making a decision that everyone around her was certain would kill her. Thomas Colby died in the second week of October, 3 days after a wagon wheel gave out on the frozen edge of a gully and took him down with it. He left behind a half-built cabin with one wall still open to the weather, a debt at the trading post that had been growing since the spring planting failed, and a wife who had never once been asked to make a decision about the land, because Thomas had always made those decisions himself. Margaret was 34 years old. She had come west from a Pennsylvania town with stone houses and paved streets, married a man with more hope than money, and spent 6 years learning that hope did not keep a family fed. Her son Eli was 9, old enough to carry water and stack wood, too young to be told the whole truth about how little they had left. The neighbors came the way neighbors do after a burial, with pies and sympathy and a great deal of advice she had not asked for. Sell the land, they told her. Move into town before the first heavy snow. A woman alone could not finish a cabin, could not cut enough wood, could not last a territory winter without a man's hands to help her. She listened to all of it and said very little, which people later mistook for grief, though it was something closer to arithmetic. She had counted the wood already stacked, and it was not enough. She had counted the money left after the burial, and it was almost nothing. She had counted the days before the first hard frost, and there were not many of them. What she had also counted, though she told no one this yet, was a hillside behind a half-finished cabin. There was a hollow there, a shallow cave cut into the rock by some older water that no longer ran, a place the previous owner of the land had once used to store root vegetables and had otherwise avoided. Children in the area were told not to play near it. Somewhere along the way, without any particular reason, people had started calling it the tomb. Margaret had noticed something about that hollow the previous winter, back when Thomas was still alive to notice things with her. On the coldest mornings, when frost coated every fence post and every shingle for a mile, the ground just inside that opening stayed bare. She had mentioned it once, in passing, and Thomas had shrugged and said the rock probably held the sun a little longer than open ground. Neither of them had thought more about it. Now, with winter closing in a cabin that would take money and time she did not have, Margaret found herself walking back up to that hollow more than once, standing at its mouth, running her hand along stone that felt different from the frozen ground around it. She did not yet have a plan. She had a question. And in the weeks that followed, That question would turn into the decision that would make her, for a while, the most talked about widow in the territory for all the wrong reasons. By the last week of October, Margaret had made up her mind, though she waited to tell anyone until she had already started. She and Eli spent 3 days clearing brush and loose stone from the mouth of the hollow, widening the opening enough for a grown woman to stand upright just inside it. The rock went back further than she had first realized, perhaps 12 feet deep and nearly as wide, narrowing toward the rear into a low crawl space she chose not to explore just yet. It was dry inside, drier than she expected, and the air did not carry the sharp by the wind that scraped across the open ridge above. She told Eli they were building a winter house in the hillside, the way some families back in Pennsylvania kept root cellars dug into slopes. He asked, reasonably, if that meant they were going to live like animals in a den. She told him animals had been living warm and dry through worse winters than theirs for longer than any person had been building cabins, and that she intended to learn something from that instead of being too proud to. Word travels fast on a thin population of neighbors, and word of what the widow Colby was doing reached Walton Pierce within the week. Pierce ran cattle 2 miles east and had survived 11 territory winters, which had taught him a healthy respect for what the season could do to careless people. He rode over one afternoon, ostensibly to ask after her wood supply, and found her instead hauling flat stones toward a hollow to build up a low wall across part of the opening. He did not laugh at her, not exactly, though later people would remember it that way. What he did was lay out, plainly and without malice, every reason he believed this plan would fail. Rock held damp, he told her. Damp air sat heavy and did not move the way air moved in a proper cabin with a proper chimney. A boy sleeping in wet stone through a hard winter was a boy who would end up coughing blood by February. He had seen dugouts before, he said, and dugouts killed people slowly, in ways that were harder to notice than a quick freeze in the open. Margaret did not argue with any of it, because she could not yet prove him wrong. What she told him instead was that she had watched this hollow through one winter already, and that whatever else was true about damp rock, this particular stretch of hillside did not behave the way open ground behaved. Frost did not sit on it the same way. Something about it was different, and she intended to find out what, because a debt at the trading post and a half-built cabin were not going to keep her son alive on their own. Pierce left unconvinced, and said as much to anyone who would listen at the trading post that week. A woman digging herself into a hillside like a badger, he said, because pride would not let her admit she needed help from her neighbors. The name the tomb, already halfway attached to the hollow, before Margaret ever moved a single stone, hardened into something closer to a settled fact after that. People began saying it the way you say the name of a place everyone already agrees is foolish. Margaret heard the talk secondhand, the way most people hear the talk about themselves, filtered through Eli's questions about why the other children at the schoolhouse kept asking if his mother had gone strange in the head. She did not answer those questions the way anger would have wanted her to. She went back up the hillside instead, and kept working. The construction that followed was neither fast nor simple, and Margaret made more mistakes in 3 weeks than she cared to admit to Pierce or anyone else. Her first plan had been to close off the mouth of the hollow entirely, with a low wall of stacked stone and mud, leaving only a narrow door frame built from salvaged cabin lumber. She and Eli worked at it through the last days of October, packing clay dug from a nearby creek bank into the gaps between stones, the way she remembered Norwegian family 2 farms over had once sealed their own root cellar. The wall went up crooked in places and took longer than she expected, but by the first week of November it stood, and the hollow behind it felt noticeably different from the open air outside. What she had not planned for was smoke. She built a small hearth just inside the entrance, using flat stones arranged around a shallow pit, venting through a narrow gap she had left near the top of the stone wall. The first evening she lit fire in it. Smoke rolled back into the hollow instead of climbing out, filling the space until both she and Eli were coughing and forced to duck back outside into the cold to breathe. It took her 2 more attempts and a good deal of frustration before she understood that the vent needed to sit higher and angled differently, to let the smoke find its own way out rather than fighting the still air trapped near the ceiling of the hollow. Pierce, riding past on other business, watched this from a distance more than once and said nothing, though Margaret later learned he had told his wife that the widow Colby was going to smoke herself and her boy out of that hole before the ground even froze solid. The detail that mattered most, however, was one Margaret had not fully explained to Pierce, because she did not yet fully understand herself. Deep in the rear of the hollow, past the low crawl space she had avoided at first, the rock did something she had never seen open ground do. On mornings when frost coated every post and rail for a mile in every direction, the stone at the back of that passage stayed faintly damp instead of frozen, and faintly warm to the touch, warmer than November air by a margin she could not yet explain. She spent several cold mornings simply kneeling there with her hand against the stone, the way a person tests a stove they do not trust yet, before deciding this deeper section was where she and Eli would actually sleep, rather than nearer the entrance where she had first assumed the warmth from the hearth would matter most. It was an uncomfortable decision to make on instinct alone, moving her son's bedding further into rock that Pierce had warned her would slowly ruin his lungs. But the ground itself seemed to be telling her something the neighbors could not, and by late November, with the first real snow already dusting the ridge above them, she chose to trust the rock over the rumor. The first true test came on a night in early December, when the temperature outside dropped, by the trading post crude thermometer, to somewhere near 10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to crack the top inch of the water barrel Margaret kept near the entrance. Inside the hollow, the hearth burned low but steady, and for first hours of the night, Margaret allowed herself something close to relief. Then, sometime past midnight, she woke to the sound of Eli coughing and her own hand landing in a patch of bedding that had gone unexpectedly damp. She lit a small lamp and found water beaded along the stone near where they slept, running in thin lines down toward the floor. It was not frost, not the sharp white crystal of ice forming on cold rock. It was something closer to the sweat that gathers on the outside of a cold cup left in a warm room, though she did not yet have the words to describe it that way. Whatever it was, it had soaked through part of the bedding and left the air inside the hollow feeling thick and close, and Eli's cough was worse than it had been the night before. Pierce's warning came back to her in the dark, unwelcome and specific. Damp rock, a boy coughing through the winter. She spent that night wide awake, moving bedding away from the wet stone, feeding the fire higher than she had intended to in order to dry the air, and turning over, again and again, the frightening possibility that she had made exactly the mistake everyone had predicted she would make. By morning, exhausted and frightened in a way she had not allowed herself to be since the burial, Margaret walked the length of the hollow with the lamp, studying every section of wall the way she imagined a builder might, though she had no training in any of it. What she noticed, once she was calm enough to notice anything, was that the water was not appearing everywhere. It gathered thickest in one particular stretch of wall near where the ceiling dipped lowest, a spot where the air seemed to sit still rather than move toward a vent she had built near the hearth. It was not the rock itself failing her, she began to suspect. It was the air inside the hollow, trapped and unmoving in certain low corners, carrying moisture that had nowhere to go. The heat from the earth was real. She had felt it herself for weeks. But heat without movement of air, she was starting to understand, could turn a dry stone hollow into something closer to what Pierce had always warned it would become. She did not have an answer yet. What she had was a smaller, more specific question than the one she had started with, and a boy whose cough she needed to solve before the next hard freeze arrived. Margaret spent the better part of a week after that frightening night doing something the neighbors would have found strange to watch, had any of them bothered to climb the ridge and look. She walked the hillside slowly, morning after morning, studying frost. On clear, cold mornings, Frost formed almost everywhere across the exposed ground and rock of the ridge, a thin white coat over everything the sun had not yet reached. But along one particular seam of stone, running roughly waist-high across the rear third of the hollow, and continuing a short distance outside it along the hillside itself, frost never quite settled, even on the coldest mornings. She had noticed this the year before, in passing, without understanding what it meant. Now she paid attention to it the way she once might have paid attention to a doctor's instructions. She began to suspect, slowly and without anyone confirming for her, that this seam marked something happening beneath the surface of the hill itself, some deeper layer of earth that held on to warmth from the seasons before, releasing it steadily upward to the stone regardless of what the sky above was doing. It was not fire. It was not magic. It was simply the ground doing what deep ground does, holding a temperature far steadier than the air ever could, summer or winter. The trouble was not the warmth. The trouble was that the warmth was arriving in a space with no clear way for damp air to leave once it had done its work. She thought back to the vent she had eventually gotten right above a hearth. How the smoke had only found its way out once she'd given a proper angled path with somewhere higher to climb toward. Perhaps the same problem was true of the moisture gathering deeper in the hollow, not near the fire at all, but in that low, still corner where the ceiling dipped and the air had nowhere obvious to go. Working mostly with Eli's help once his cough had eased, she cut a second, smaller opening near the back of the hollow, angled upward through a natural crack in the rock that widened as it rose, letting it meet open air higher up the hillside, well above the entrance. It was rough work, done with a hand drill, a chisel, and considerable patience, and it took the better part of 4 days to widen the crack enough to matter. The change was not dramatic at first. It rarely is. But within a week, the damp patch near the low ceiling had noticeably shrunk, and the bedding Margaret and Eli slept on stayed dry through nights nearly as cold as the one that had frightened her so badly. She had not defeated the problem entirely. She suspected, correctly as it turned out, that a truly severe storm would still test this arrangement in ways a quiet December night could not. But for the first time since the frightening night with the wet bedding, she allowed herself something like the beginning of confidence. The territory's first serious storm of the season arrived in the middle of December, a 2-day blow that dropped perhaps 8 inches of snow and drove temperatures down near zero for the better part of 2 nights. It was not, by any measure, the worst the region had seen, but it was enough to serve as a genuine test, and enough to draw attention from neighbors curious whether the widow Colby and her son had survived their strange arrangement at all. Pierce rode out himself on the second morning after the storm broke, partly out of the same instinct that would later send him up the hillside during the far worse storm to come, and partly, he admitted much later, out of simple curiosity he was not proud of. He found the trail to the hollow already cleared, smoke rising cleanly from the angled vent Margaret had cut into the hillside, and Eli outside splitting kindling with color at his cheeks, and no trace of the cough that had worried his mother weeks before. Inside, Pierce found the air surprisingly still and dry, nothing like the closed, damp feeling he had expected from a stone hollow sealed against the plains winter. The rear wall, when he touched it, without quite meaning to, held that same steady warmth Margaret had first noticed the winter before, more pronounced now than it had been in autumn, though still nowhere near what a proper hearth could produce. He did not fully change his position that day, and later admitted he had left the hollow more puzzled than convinced. A single small storm proved only that the arrangement could survive a single small storm. It said nothing yet about 6 weeks of unbroken cold, or the kind of blizzard that could bury a cabin roof under drifting snow for days. Pierce knew, as anyone who had spent a decade on the plains knew, that the true danger of a territory winter rarely arrived in the first storm. It arrived in whichever storm came last, after the wood was low, after the patience was thin, and after every small weakness in a shelter had already been quietly tested by everything that came before it. Still, he rode home that day and told his wife something he had not intended to say aloud. The widow's hillside, he admitted, was drier and steadier than he had expected, and he could not entirely explain why. It was not agreement. It was not yet respect, but it was a first crack in an opinion that had, until then, been settled. Margaret, for her part, took no particular satisfaction from Pierce's visit. She had passed one storm. She had a debt still owed at the trading post, with supplies she was watching carefully, and a lingering unease about what a truly severe winter might still find, in a hollow she had built largely by instinct and correction rather than any real training. That unease would prove, before winter's end, to be entirely justified. By the middle of January, talk at the trading post had shifted from the widow Colby's strange choice of shelter to something larger and more frightening for the whole territory. A trapper coming down from the north country brought word of a storm system building across the plains unlike anything the older settlers could recall. An elderly rancher who had lived in the territory since before it was a territory said the signs reminded him of a winter from 52 years earlier. One still spoken of in a handful of surviving family accounts as the hardest anyone could remember. Whether the comparison was entirely accurate or partly the exaggeration that gathers around any approaching storm, no one could say for certain. What mattered was that people believed it, and began preparing as though it were true. Pierce, hauling extra feed to his cattle and reinforcing his own barn against wind, found himself thinking often of the hillside 2 miles west. He mentioned to a few neighbors, half joking and half not, that he would put money on the widow Colby abandoning her hollow for someone's spare room the moment this storm arrived in earnest. Several of the men laughed and agreed. It was one thing to survive an ordinary December squall in a hole dug into a hillside. It was another thing entirely to survive whatever was now bearing down from the north. Margaret heard about the wager second-hand and slightly exaggerated, the way she heard most things concerning herself. She did not seek out Pierce to argue the point. Instead, she spent the days before the storm doing the only thing she trusted anymore, which was checking every seam and joint of the hollow by hand, packing fresh clay into any gap the winter had opened since November, and stacking what remained of her firewood as close to the hearth as space allowed. She also did something she had not done since the frightening night in December. She moved Eli's bedding slightly forward from the deepest, warmest section of the hollow, closer to the entrance and the hearth, reasoning that if the storm proved severe enough to drive smoke or damp back into that rear corner, she wanted her son close enough to reach quickly, even if it meant a few degrees less warm from the stone itself. It was not a decision born of confidence. It was a decision of a mother who had already been wrong once that winter and did not intend to gamble everything on being right twice. By the last week of January, the sky over the territory had taken on the low, heavy gray that experienced ranchers recognized without needing to be told what it meant. The storm, it would later be remembered, with only slight exaggeration, as the worst in 52 years, was 2 days away, and everyone on that stretch of the plains, including a widow in a hillside hollow that half the community still called a tomb, was about to find out exactly what their preparations were worth. The blizzard arrived on a Tuesday evening and did not let go for the better part of 3 days. By the second night, snow had drifted higher than the top of the low stone wall Margaret had built across the hollow's entrance, and wind was driving directly into the hillside from a direction it rarely came from, a shift that would matter more than anyone, including Margaret, initially understood. The angled vent she had cut into the rear crack, the one that had solved the damn problem back in December, had been built to draw air upward and away from prevailing wind that came from the west. This storm, unusually, was pushing hard from the north, and by the second night, smoke that should have climbed cleanly out of the vent began, faintly at first, to push back down into the hollow instead. Margaret noticed it before Eli did, a change in the smell of the air rather than anything she could see clearly by lamplight. She banked the fire lower, uncertain whether reducing the heat or increasing airflow was a safer choice, and spent an anxious hour testing the difference by feel, Her hand held near the vent opening to sense which way the air was truly moving. It was Eli, oddly enough, who noticed the second problem first, waking with a start and saying only that the wall near the back felt cold in a way it had not felt before. Margaret crossed the hollow and found he was right. The steady warmth from the deep stone, the same warmth that had carried them through December and reassured Pierce in his one uncertain visit, had noticeably faded near the section closest to where the northern wind was now driving hardest against the outside of the hillside. She would understand only later, from a conversation the following spring with an old stonemason passing to the territory, that a wind striking rock from an unusual angle can pull heat away from a stone's surface far faster than still. Cold air ever could, a process with names she never fully learned but effects she experienced directly that night. For roughly 2 hours in the depth of that second night, Margaret Colby faced a decision with no clearly right answer. She could feed the fire higher, risking the smoke that was already threatening to back up through the shifted vent. She could move Eli again, away from the cooling rear wall, toward the entrance where the wind's force was strongest against the stacked stone barrier she had built. Or she could attempt in the dark, in the worst wind of the storm so far, to pack additional clay and stone against the outside of the vent opening, changing its angle enough to fight the new direction of the wind. She chose the third option, wrapping herself against the storm and working by feel more than sight, packing wet clay against freezing stone with hands that had gone numb within minutes. It took, by her own later account, nearly an hour of work in conditions that would have stopped most people from trying at all. When she finally crawled back inside, exhausted and shaken with cold herself, there was no way yet to know whether the adjustment had worked, or whether she had simply spent the last of her strength on a fix that would fail before morning. The wind broke sometime before dawn on the third day, the way plain storms often do, not gradually but almost all at once, as though the sky had simply run out of anger. Margaret had not slept. She had spent the remaining hours of darkness feeding the fire in small, careful mounts, checking the vent by hand every half hour, and sitting close enough to Eli to feel each breath he took, listening for any return of the cough that had frightened her back in December. By the first gray light, the smoke was climbing cleanly again, drawn upward to the repacked vent exactly as it had before the wind shifted, and the deep stone at the rear of the hollow, when she finally allowed herself to check it, had begun to hold warmed again, slow and steady, the way that all winter before this one storm tested it past anything she had planned for. It was Pierce, along with 3 other neighbors, who climbed the hillside that morning, exactly as the introduction to the story described, expecting to find exactly what a storm called the worst in 52 years generally left behind on an exposed ridge. What they found instead was a hollow that had gone cold in one section during the worst hours of the night and had recovered largely on its own by morning, a boy asleep with color in his face, and a widow too exhausted to fully explain, at first, everything she had done in the dark to keep the arrangement holding through a wind it had never been built to face. Pierce touched the rear wall himself that morning, the detail that opens this story, and felt something he had spent an entire winter refusing to quite believe. He did not offer a grand apology. That was not, by every account that survived him, the kind of man he was. What he did in the weeks that followed was quietly stop calling the hollow the tomb and start referring to it, when he referred to it all, simply as the widow Colby's place, a small correction that meant more to Margaret than any apology could have. The storm that had been compared to one from 52 years earlier did, in the end, prove nearly as severe as the older settlers had feared, damaging barns and killing livestock across a wide stretch of the territory. Margaret Colby's hollow had not passed through it without difficulty. It had come close to failing in the second night, in the one stretch of hours when an unexpected wind found a single weakness her design had never accounted for. What carried her and her son through was not the stone alone and not luck, but the same habit she had built since October, of watching the ground closely enough to notice what it was actually doing, rather than trusting either superstition or assumption to tell her what a hillside hollow was supposed to be. By the following autumn, Margaret Colby had paid down most of what remained of her debt at the trading post. Selling root vegetables that stored unusually well in a portion of the hollow, she converted for exactly that purpose. Once she understood how steadily the deep stone held its temperature through every season, not only winter. Pierce, for his part, never publicly admitted he had been entirely wrong about damp rock and failing lungs, though 2 years later, when his own son fell seriously ill during a hard winter, it was Pierce who rode to Margaret's hillside asking careful questions about how she had solved the problem of moving air through still, cold stone. She answered him plainly, the way she wished someone had answered her honestly back in October, and the two families remained, from that point on, something closer to allies than the strangers they had been. The name the tune faded slowly from local conversation, the way unkind names sometimes do once the story behind them stops matching what people actually see. What replaced it was never especially poetic. Most neighbors simply called it Colby's hillside, and left it at that. But among the handful of families who later dug similar shelters into similar slopes across that stretch of the territory, a version of Margaret's story, and a rough understanding of what she had learned about deep, steady ground heat and the stubborn need for air to have somewhere to go, passed quietly from one household to the next for a generation or more. The stone had never once produced its own heat. It had simply refused to lose, as quickly as open ground did, whatever warmth the earth beneath it had been holding on to all along. That distinction, small and unglamorous as it sounds, was the entire difference between a hollow the community once feared as a grave and a shelter that carried a widow and her son to the coldest winter anyone in that territory could remember. She was never rich after that winter, and she never fully escaped being remembered, at least at first, as a strange widow who lived in a cave. But by the time Eli was grown, the story people told about her had changed its shape entirely. It was no longer a story about a woman foolish enough to bury herself in a hillside. It was a story about the only person on that ridge willing to ask what the ground itself already knew, long before anyone had bothered to listen for the answer. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.